The Topping B200 is a dumb amplifier. There, I said it. But don't worry, I'm not insulting these fairly affordable monoblock power amplifiers. It's just the truth. There are no fancy bells and whistles on these. No volume control, no remote control. They're just a dumb power amp. And that's great because it means all the emphasis in their design should have gone towards sound quality. But I'm a little bit concerned it went somewhere else entirely. The Topping B200 is a $599 monoblock power amplifier able to deliver 200 watts into either a 4 ohm or an 8 ohm load. That means it's a very powerful amplifier for not very much money. Being a monoblock also means that you'll need two of them for a 2-channel stereo setup. So realistically, you're looking at $1,200 for a stereo pair. I don't own many comparable amplifiers at around the price of the B200s, but I've compared the B200s against 4 different power amplifiers at all different price points and with all different design approaches to make sure that I can describe for you just how good or not good the B200s are. And the answer is, it depends. Before I break down the sound, let's talk briefly about the design of these amplifiers. They're each about the size of 4 house bricks stacked together, and they weigh just a little bit less than that same pile of bricks would. On the front of each amplifier is a power button that you can also short press to jump between the 3 different inputs. And then, as you'd expect, those 3 inputs can be found on the back of the amplifiers. They're both XLR or TRS connectors, and then you'll also find the speaker binding posts, a power input for a DIN style connector that comes from the included power brick. There's a USB-C socket that's for firmware only. There's no DAC or anything built in here. There's a switch for the high gain or the low gain option. And then there's a 12-volt trigger input. And that's where things start to go a little bit pear-shaped for me. I would have loved to see a pair of 12-volt trigger inputs on the B200s. In other words, one coming in and one going out. And that's because depending on your setup, you might have these far apart, maybe one near each speaker, and you need to run an individual 12-volt trigger lead to each of these amplifiers. But if you're anything like me, you might put the 2 amplifiers near each other, maybe even stacked on top of each other, and then it would be really handy to just run one 12-volt trigger from your preamp, your DAC, whatever's doing the control, and have that go to the first B200 and then a short daisy chain to the second. In some setups, having to run 2 long 12-volt trigger leads is going to be a hassle, and it's going to mean you have to buy extra leads. On that note, they don't even come with the 12-volt trigger leads, which I consistently find annoying on products that use them. It's a very cheap 3.5mm cable. It doesn't have to be of any particular quality. It just has to carry a 12-volt signal. And so I'd really like to start seeing these brands that use 12-volt trigger systems, which are great, include the cheap basic 12-volt cables. Now, admittedly, this is all a pretty minor gripe, so let's move on and talk about sound. Prior to testing these, I'd been alternating between the Enlium AMP23R and the Burson Timekeeper GTs as my main speaker amps. In other words, both of my reference speaker amp setups are far more expensive than the B200s. And so it should come as no surprise that the B200s didn't match up to the systems I was used to. Specifically, the sense of clarity, separation, and image focus was all significantly reduced going to the B200s from these much more premium and more expensive amplifiers. And that's even if the DAC and the preamp feeding them stayed the same. In other words, really high end up the source chain and just changing the amplifiers down the source chain. None of that is a knock against the B200s though, because you can buy 2 B200s for less than half the price of a single Burson Timekeeper monoblock. And the Enlium AMP23R is even more expensive again. And so once the B200s were in my system, I just spent a couple of weeks listening to them as my one and only amplifier. In that setup, they were fed by multiple different DACs and preamps, and I appreciated their sound, but I was never stopped by them. And that's an important point for us to hold on to. You know how some setups will just stop you in your tracks sometimes? You'll be doing something else, you're listening to music maybe in the background, or maybe you're actually listening to music but you're not paying full attention, and then suddenly the sound is just so good that you can't do anything but stop and do your best Keanu Reeves impersonation. Whoa. Well, that never happened for me with the B200s, and I think I can explain why, but we'll get to that. Overall, the sound from the B200s was very enjoyable. They produce a clean and well-focused image with a good soundstage size via the Harmouth P3 ESR XDs. Vocals are smooth and with a nice sense of richness, but without ever getting thick or overly creamy. In other words, the B200s aren't a cold or sterile amp, and I really appreciate that about their sound. However, during my time that I was testing the B200s, I also received new stock of the KT88 reserve tubes from Ray Tubes, and I wanted to test them out. And by the way, the review of those tubes is coming up soon, so subscribe and ring the bell if you're interested. To test the KT88 reserves, I swapped out the B200s briefly over to my Elekit TU8200R amplifier. In total, the Elekit setup that I was running probably cost about $1,500 US. I haven't done the precise mathematics on it, and it also happens to offer a really lovely headphone amp for high impedance headphones. Of course, being a tube amp, you can also tweak it to sound exactly how you like. Now, being a tube amp, you're probably expecting me to say that the Elekit TU8200R sounded richer, warmer, and more euphonic than the B200s. You know, more lush and more enjoyable. Well, you'd be wrong. The TU8200R was noticeably more resolving and more crisp than the B200s. In comparison, the pair of B200s was delivering a sound that lacked a bit of dynamics and energy compared to the TU8200R tube amp. The B200s almost sounded a touch muted up top, almost that it was sleepy and dull sounding compared to the Elekit TU8200R with the KT88 reserve tubes and 12AU7 select tubes, all from Ray Tubes. And it was this test that started to reveal to me what I think might be wrong with the B200s. It doesn't make them a bad amp, and they are still excellent value, but I think you need to understand what you're buying before you rush out and buy the B200s. In other words, the B200s will be great for some people, but you need to know what you're looking for. On a track like Flower Skin, the opening passage sounds wonderful from the B200s. It's smooth, it's rich, it's still clean, it's just enjoyable. For a Measurement First designed amplifier, the B200s have a very non-analytical sound, and brighter or more aggressive speaker setups will probably benefit from their sound. As you'd expect, there's no sense of emphasis or coloration from the B200s. Tonally, they're very neutral, but not so much when we think about their sense of energy and dynamics. And that's what got me thinking about the V3 monos. I like the very, very affordable Fosi Audio V3 mono monoblocks, but they can also tend to be a little bit polite. So I had the question, are the B200s better than a set of V3 monos fully upgraded with all the op amps changed? It's always hard comparing amplifiers when you can't switch immediately between them, but I'm pretty sure that the B200s were delivering a slightly wider soundstage than the Fosi Audio V3 monos running SS3602 op amps in all sockets. Those are the Sparco Labs op amps. Curiously, the soundstage from the B200s also shifted slightly higher compared to the V3 monos, which is neither better or worse, it was just different and interesting. One area that the V3 monos might have had a slight edge was that I think their sound might have been just a little bit more dynamic sounding than the B200s. But that slight improvement in dynamics came at the expense of imaging seeming slightly less focused and precise within the soundstage. It was like each sound from the V3 monos had slightly less cleanly defined edges that were maybe just smeared ever so slightly, whereas going back to the B200s tightened that focus back up again. Another area of strength from the B200s compared to the V3 monos was their sense of resolution. I could hear more subtle details and cues in the music from the B200s than what I could hear from the fully upgraded V3 monos. I say fully upgraded, that's without going to the trouble of modifying the casework or running them open to allow for bigger op amps like the Burson V7s or even the Sparco's Pro op amps. But with a normal op amp that you can fit in the V3 monos, I couldn't get them to match the B200s. And so this brings us around to a bit of a summary after covering a lot of ground. The topping B200s are a nice amplifier for sure, but they're not necessarily the best amplifier for the price because they have their strengths and weaknesses. If you were looking for an upgrade beyond something like the Fosi Audio V3 monos, the AEMA A70, the FX Audio L07, or the Fosi Audio ZA3, the B200s are a lovely step forward. Basically, if you're coming from any of the very affordable Class D amplifiers on the market, the B200s are a significant upgrade. However, I think it's also important to consider what you want your system to sound like, because buying a pair of B200s means buying a slightly subdued and less dynamic sound, which could be perfect depending on your speakers. And now, to be clear, when I'm saying that they're less dynamic and less energetic, I'm not saying that the B200s have any sort of tonal coloration. Tonally, they're a very accurate amplifier. They're not dark or warm sounding in any way. They just lack a sense of attack and energy compared to other amps that I've tried, like the Elekit 2U 8200R. And my experience with a whole lot of different amplifiers would suggest that maybe this is coming from Topping's use of an NFCA design or a nested feedback design. This is how they get their measurements to be so good in terms of distortion. It's by running it through a series of nested feedback loops. The problem with nested feedback is it can minutely smear the timing accuracy of the signal just enough that it messes with our brain's ability to properly understand the transient timing, the sense of attack, even some of the timbral nuances of music and instruments can be affected by those systems. And that's why a tube amplifier like the 8200R could actually come across crisper, cleaner, and more energetic than a far more technically capable and higher measuring amp like the B200. Now that's just a theory on my part. It's possible that the cause of this is something completely different again, but it doesn't change what I've heard, it just changes the cause. And so the takeaway on all of this is that the B200 is an excellent upgrade option if you're coming from something like an affordable Class D amp. If you like the general sound of those amps and want a better version of it, then the B200 could be just the ticket. But if you want your system to have more clarity and dynamics, then I do think there are better options out there, such as picking up an 8200R while they still exist. And so if you want to pick up yourself a pair of B200s, I've got links in the description down below through to Apos, who provided this pair, and also some other links for those of you that are outside the US and Canada. If you want to go down a different route and get into a world of a bit more dynamics and a bit more energy, then I've linked my review up here to the Elekit 2U 8200R amplifier. I built this one from the ground up as a DIY kit, but you can also get it pre-built, and it's a wonderful, wonderful amp. So check out that review next if you're interested in that one. But in the meantime, let me say a huge thank you to channel members here on YouTube, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks on YouTube videos just like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.